"Get off my property, Karen." Hank Lawson's voice boomed across the ranch, echoing off the barn walls and scattering a flock of startled birds into the sky. But Karen didn't flinch. Oh no, she stood her ground like some self-appointed sheriff of suburbia, clipboard clutched in one hand and her phone in the other, ready to dial 911 like her life depended on it. "You don't get to tell me what to do," she snapped, her oversized sunglasses sliding down her nose as she jabbed a perfectly manicured finger in Hank's direction. "This property is in violation of HOA regulations, and I'm here to make sure you're held accountable." Hank stared at her, dumbfounded. "Lady," he said slowly, his voice dripping with disbelief, "this is a ranch. I don't even live in your HOA." Karen smirked, tilting her head like she'd just caught him in some elaborate lie. "Oh, but you do," she said triumphantly. "Your property is within 1 mile of our neighborhood, which means you're subject to our rules." Hank blinked at her. Then he let out a low chuckle, the kind that comes from a man who's seen it all and isn't about to let some clipboard-wielding busybody ruin his day. "Ma'am," he drawled, leaning casually against the fence post. "You're standing in cow poop." Karen gasped and stumbled back, glancing down at her designer sneakers in horror. But instead of retreating like any sane person would, she doubled down. "That's exactly my point," she shrieked, waving her clipboard like it was some holy decree. This biohazard is unacceptable. There are children in our neighborhood who could be exposed to," she paused dramatically, "diseases." Now, Hank Lawson was not a man who lost his temper easily. He'd survived Vietnam, raised 3 kids, and run this ranch through droughts, floods, and everything in between. But accusing his cattle, his pride and joy, of being diseased, that was a step too far. He straightened up and crossed his arms over his chest. "Lady," he said evenly, though there was a dangerous glint in his eye, "my cows are healthier than half the people in your HOA. Karen ignored him completely and pulled out her phone with a flourish. "I'm calling the sheriff," she announced like she was unveiling some grand master plan. "This property is in clear violation of HOA regulations." Hank sighed deeply and shook his head as he watched her dial 911 with all the righteous fury of someone who'd never been told no in their life. This was going to be interesting. While they waited for the sheriff to arrive, Karen began pacing around Hank's property like she was conducting an FBI raid. She snapped pictures of everything: the barn, the tractor, even Duke, Hank's old hound dog who was napping lazily on the porch. "You're going down for this?" Karen muttered under her breath as she scribbled notes on her clipboard with an intensity that suggested she thought she was solving Watergate. Hank leaned against the fence post again and tipped his hat back with an amused smirk. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've always wondered what it's like to have so much free time you can harass strangers for fun." Karen shot him a glare that could curdle milk but didn't respond. When the sheriff finally pulled up in his dusty patrol car, a man named Tom who'd known Hank since high school, Karen practically sprinted over to him like he was her knight in shining armor. "Officer!" she cried dramatically, clutching her clipboard to her chest like it was a lifeline. "Thank goodness you're here. This man," she pointed at Hank with all the righteous indignation she could muster, "is running an illegal operation on his property. It's a danger to public health." Sheriff Tom stepped out of his car slowly, adjusting his hat as he surveyed the scene. He looked at Karen, then at Hank, then back at Karen again. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice calm but firm, "what exactly seems to be the problem?" Karen launched into a tirade about biohazards and diseased cattle and how Hank's barn must be hiding something illegal because it smelled bad. Tom listened patiently while Hank stood there with his arms crossed and an expression that said, "I told you so," without him having to say a word. When Karen finally ran out of steam, Tom turned to Hank with a raised eyebrow. "Hank," he said dryly, "you hiding any meth labs in that barn of yours?" Hank grinned and shook his head. "Just hay bales and horse feed." Tom nodded thoughtfully before turning back to Karen. "Ma'am," he said politely but firmly, "do you have any actual evidence of wrongdoing here?" Karen faltered for just a moment before recovering with all the confidence of someone who thinks Google searches count as legal expertise. She thrust her clipboard toward Tom and declared triumphantly, "These documents prove that this property is subject to HOA regulations." Tom took one look at the papers before handing them back without even reading them. "Ma'am," he said with barely concealed exasperation, "this ranch isn't part of your HOA." Karen blinked at him like he'd just told her gravity wasn't real. "What do you mean it's not part of the HOA? It's within 1 mile of our neighborhood." Tom let out a long-suffering sigh, the kind only someone who deals with Karens regularly can produce, and explained slowly, "HOA rules only apply to properties that are part of the HOA agreement when they're purchased. This ranch has been here since before your neighborhood even existed." For a moment there was silence except for Duke snoring softly on the porch. Then Karen exploded, "That can't be right. There must be some mistake." Hank decided it was time to put an end to this circus act once and for all. He walked over to his truck and pulled out a thick folder filled with legal documents, property deeds, zoning permits, you name it. "Here," he said as he handed them to Tom with a grin. "Feel free to double-check." Tom flipped through the papers while Karen watched nervously from the sidelines. After a few minutes, Tom looked up at Karen with an expression that could only be described as done. "Well," he said slowly as he handed the folder back to Hank, "everything checks out here." He turned back to Karen with raised eyebrows. "Looks like you're barking up the wrong tree." And just like that, the tables had turned completely. "Well, this isn't over," Karen huffed, crossing her arms like a toddler denied a second helping of dessert. Her face was redder than Hank's old tractor, and for a moment, it looked like steam might actually shoot out of her ears. She spun on her heel, stomped toward her car, and slammed the door so hard it rattled the windows. But before she left, she rolled down the window and yelled, "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." Hank waved at her with a grin. "Tell him I said hi," he called back. Sheriff Tom gave Hank a knowing look as Karen's car screeched out of the driveway. "You sure know how to pick your neighbors," he said with a chuckle. Hank shrugged. "I didn't pick her. She just showed up one day like a bad rash." Tom laughed and shook his head. "Well, good luck with that one," he said before climbing back into his patrol car. "Something tells me she's not the type to let things go." And boy, was he right. The very next morning, Hank woke up to find a certified letter taped to his front gate. It was from Karen, or rather, from her lawyer, who had apparently been roped into this nonsense against his will. The letter accused Hank of violating HOA bylaws, again, and demanded that he remove his barn, relocate his cattle, and, get this, repaint his house to match the neutral tones of the HOA-approved color palette. Hank read the letter twice just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. Then he burst out laughing so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Neutral tones? On a ranch? What was she expecting, beige cows? He folded the letter neatly, stuck it in his pocket, and went about his day as if nothing had happened. But Karen wasn't done yet. By noon, she was back, this time with 2 other members of the HOA board in tow. They were both older gentlemen in ill-fitting suits who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else but standing in Hank's driveway. "Mr. Lawson," Karen began in her most official-sounding voice, "we're here to conduct an inspection of your property." Hank leaned against his truck and crossed his arms. "An inspection?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" Karen held up a piece of paper triumphantly. "As per Section 8A of the HOA bylaws," she said, "the board has the right to inspect any property within its jurisdiction for compliance." Hank smirked. "And you think my ranch is within your jurisdiction?" Karen's confidence faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "We've already established that it is," she said firmly. Hank shook his head and pulled out his phone. "Hold on," he said as he started scrolling through his emails. "Let me just pull up that letter from my lawyer." Karen's face paled slightly at the mention of lawyers, but she stood her ground. "Ah, here it is," Hank said after a moment. He held up his phone and began reading aloud, "Dear Mr. Lawson, as per Montana state law and local zoning ordinances, your property is classified as agricultural land and is therefore exempt from all HOA regulations." He lowered the phone and grinned at Karen. "Would you like me to forward you a copy?" Karen sputtered incoherently for a moment before turning to one of the board members for support. Maybe we should double-check that. One of them muttered nervously. Karen shot him a glare that could have melted steel. There's no need to double-check anything, she snapped before turning back to Hank. We're here to do our job. Hank sighed and stepped aside with a sweeping gesture toward his property. Be my guest, he said with mock politeness. And so began what could only be described as the most ridiculous inspection in HOA history. Karen marched around the ranch like she was leading an army into battle, pointing out every little thing she deemed unacceptable. The barn was too tall, the tractor was too loud, and the cows? Well, apparently there were too many of them. This is excessive livestock. Meanwhile, Hank followed behind her with Duke trotting lazily at his heels, trying and failing not to laugh at her increasingly absurd complaints. At one point, Karen stopped in front of an old wooden sign that read, Lawson Ranch ST 1912, and declared it an eyesore. That sign has been here longer than you've been alive, Hank pointed out dryly. Well, it's outdated, Karen shot back. It's called history, Hank replied with a shrug. By the time they finished their so-called inspection, Karen looked like she was ready to explode from sheer frustration. This isn't over, she said through gritted teeth as she stomped back toward her car. You already said that yesterday, Hank called after her with a grin, and just like that, she was gone again. But Hank knew better than to think this would be the end of it. Sure enough, later that week he received yet another letter from Karen's lawyer, this time threatening legal action if he didn't comply with their demands within 30 days. Hank didn't even bother reading past the first paragraph before tossing it into the trash can. He had bigger things to worry about than some power-hungry HOA president on a mission to ruin his life. But little did Karen know, Hank wasn't just sitting idly by while she waged her one-woman war against him. No siree. He had a plan brewing that would make sure Karen regretted ever stepping foot on his ranch in the first place. Because if there's one thing you don't mess with in Montana, it's a rancher who knows how to fight back. Now, you'd think that after 2 failed attempts to strong-arm Hank, Karen would have packed it up and gone home to terrorize someone else. But nope. Karen wasn't the kind of person to let logic or the law get in the way of her crusade. She was determined to bring Hank down, even if it meant making a complete fool of herself in the process. A few days after her so-called inspection, Hank was sitting on his porch with Duke, enjoying a cup of coffee and the peaceful morning air, when he noticed something strange. A shiny black SUV was parked just down the road, barely visible behind some bushes. It didn't belong to any of his neighbors, and it sure as heck wasn't a rancher's vehicle. No mud on the tires, no dents from hauling equipment. Just a spotless, city slicker car that looked completely out of place. Hank squinted at it for a moment before shrugging it off. Maybe it was a lost tourist or someone bird-watching. He had bigger things to worry about, like fixing the fence Karen had knocked loose during her little tantrum last week. But then, over the next few days, he noticed the SUV kept showing up. Sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, but always parked in the same spot. And every time he glanced over at it, he could swear he saw someone ducking down behind the dashboard like they were trying not to be seen. Now, Hank wasn't a paranoid guy, but he wasn't stupid either. He decided to take a closer look. So one afternoon, while Duke napped on the porch, Hank hopped on his ATV and took a slow ride down the road toward the mystery car. As he got closer, he could see a woman sitting in the driver's seat with a pair of binoculars pressed to her face. And not just any woman, it was Karen. Of course it was Karen. Hank pulled up beside her with an amused grin and tapped on her window. Karen jumped so hard she nearly dropped her binoculars. "Bird watching?" Hank asked innocently. Karen fumbled with her words for a moment before finally managing to say, "I'm conducting surveillance." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Surveillance? On what?" Karen straightened up in her seat and tried to look official. "On your illegal activities," she said matter-of-factly. Hank couldn't help but laugh. "Illegal activities?" he repeated. "Lady, I'm running a ranch, not a crime syndicate." Karen narrowed her eyes at him. "We'll see about that," she said before rolling up her window and pretending to ignore him. Hank shook his head and drove back to his house, chuckling to himself the whole way. If Karen wanted to waste her time spying on him, that was her problem. But little did he know, she wasn't just spying. She was plotting. A few days later, Hank got an unexpected visit from two men in suits who introduced themselves as agents from the DEA. That's right, the Drug Enforcement Administration. Apparently, Karen had filed an anonymous tip claiming that Hank was using his barn as a front for a drug operation. Now, Hank had dealt with some ridiculous accusations in his time, everything from stealing water rights to harboring escaped livestock, but this took the cake. The agents were polite but firm as they explained why they were there. They had no choice but to investigate every tip they received, no matter how far-fetched it sounded. And since Karen had described Hank's barn as suspiciously fortified and emitting strange odors, they had to take it seriously. Hank couldn't believe what he was hearing. Fortified? He repeated incredulously. It's made of wood. The only thing it's fortified against is rain. The agents shrugged apologetically and asked if they could take a look inside. Hank sighed and led them to the barn, where they found exactly what you'd expect to find on a working ranch. Hay bales, feed sacks, tools covered in dirt and rust. Basically everything except drugs. One of the agents sniffed the air and said dryly, "Well, I guess you could say it smells suspicious. If you've never been around cows before." Hank chuckled at that while Karen, who had conveniently shown up just in time to watch the whole thing unfold from her car, looked like she was about ready to explode with frustration. But here's where things get interesting. As it turned out, Karen's little stunt had some unintended consequences. You see, while Hank wasn't hiding anything illegal in his barn, there was an actual drug operation happening in the area, a big one, and Karen's tip accidentally put the DEA on their trail. Apparently, some real criminals had been using an abandoned warehouse about 20 miles away as their base of operations. And thanks to Karen's over-the-top description of Hank's barn, barrels of chemicals, armed guards, etc., the DEA decided to expand their search radius, which led them straight to the warehouse. Within days, they'd busted one of the largest drug rings in Montana history. It made all the local news stations. DEA cracks down on rural drug operation. And guess who tried to take credit for it? That's right, Karen. She went around telling everyone that she was responsible for tipping off the DEA and cleaning up their community. She even held an impromptu press conference on her front lawn where she declared herself a hero for protecting our children from dangerous criminals. Meanwhile, Hank watched all of this unfold with equal parts amusement and disbelief. He couldn't decide what was funnier: Karen thinking she'd actually done something useful, or everyone else pretending to believe her just so she'd stop talking. But here's where karma finally came knocking. During their investigation into the drug ring, law enforcement started looking into other suspicious activity in the area, including reports of trespassing and vandalism on private property. And wouldn't you know it, they found footage from Hank's security cameras showing Karen sneaking onto his land at night with garbage bags full of trash, which she dumped right next to his barn in an attempt to frame him for illegal dumping. When confronted with the evidence by Sheriff Tom, who couldn't hide his smirk, Karen tried every excuse in the book. She was doing community service. She thought it was public land. She didn't know cameras were there. But none of it worked. She ended up getting slapped with fines for trespassing and illegal dumping. Not exactly what she had in mind when she set out to ruin Hank's life. As for Hank, well, let's just say he got more than a little satisfaction out of watching Karen finally get what she deserved. You'd think that getting caught red-handed dumping trash on Hank's property and slapped with fines would have been enough to humble Karen. But no, not Karen. If anything, it only seemed to fuel her determination to make Hank's life miserable. She wasn't just doubling down. She was tripling down, quadrupling down, and dragging everyone else in the HOA along for the ride. A week after her little garbage dumping escapade made its way through the rumor mill, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. Now, Hank didn't live in the HOA, so he wasn't invited, but he sure heard about it from his neighbor, Bill, who lived just inside the HOA boundaries and had a front row seat to Karen's antics. "She's got some kind of plan," Bill said one afternoon while leaning on the fence between their properties. She was talking about zoning laws and environmental hazards. Sounded like a whole lot of nonsense to me. Hank just shook his head and chuckled. "Let her scheme," he said. She'll dig herself into a hole eventually. And boy, was he right. Karen's grand plan, if you could call it that, was to get Hank's ranch declared an environmental hazard. She figured if she couldn't get him on HOA violations, she'd go after him through county regulations instead. So she started filing complaints with every government agency she could think of. The health department, the zoning board, even the EPA. The complaints were as ridiculous as you'd expect. She claimed Hank's cattle were polluting the groundwater, that his barn was a fire hazard, and that his tractor was releasing excessive emissions. She even tried to argue that his property was disrupting the visual harmony of the neighborhood. A phrase so absurd it made Hank laugh out loud when he heard it. Now, most of these agencies saw Karen's complaints for what they were, petty nonsense, and dismissed them outright. But a few of them were required to investigate anyway, which meant Hank started getting visits from inspectors who looked just as annoyed about being there as he was about having them on his land. One day, a guy from the county zoning office showed up with a clipboard and an apologetic smile. "Sorry about this," he said as he stepped out of his truck. "We got a complaint about, He glanced at his notes and frowned. "Unauthorized structures?" Hank raised an eyebrow. "Unauthorized structures? You mean my barn? The one that's been here since 1952. The inspector shrugged helplessly. "I know it's ridiculous," he said, "but I've got to check it out anyway." Hank sighed and led him over to the barn, where they spent all of 5 minutes confirming that it was perfectly up to code before shaking hands and parting ways. The next day, it was someone from the health department claiming they'd received reports of contaminated water on Hank's property. And the day after that, it was a guy from the fire marshal's office who'd been sent to inspect Hank's hay bales for combustibility. By the end of the week, Hank had dealt with so many inspectors that he joked about setting up a coffee station in his driveway just to make their visits more comfortable. But while all this was going on, something interesting started happening. Karen's neighbors, the ones who actually lived in her precious HOA, were starting to turn against her. You see, Karen had been running the HOA like her own personal fiefdom for years. She'd find people for having flower pots that didn't match their shutters, for leaving their trash cans out 5 minutes too long on pickup day, even for parking their cars in their own driveways instead of their garages. Most folks put up with it because they didn't want to rock the boat. But now that she'd gone full-blown crazy trying to take down Hank, they were finally starting to push back. It started small, whispers at neighborhood barbecues and side-eye glances during HOA meetings, but it didn't take long for things to escalate. One neighbor dug up old emails showing that Karen had approved landscaping projects without board approval. Another found evidence that she'd been using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, like hiring a private investigator to follow Hank around town. Yes, really? And then there was Bill, the same guy who'd warned Hank about Karen's emergency meeting, who discovered something truly damning. Karen had been fudging property lines on official maps to make it look like Hank's ranch fell under HOA jurisdiction when it didn't. When Bill brought this up at the next HOA meeting, all hell broke loose. "You can't just redraw property lines," one neighbor shouted. "This is fraud," another yelled. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she was only doing what was best for the community, but no one was buying it anymore. The board voted unanimously to remove her as president and launch an audit of all HOA finances under her leadership. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, literally, Hank was blissfully unaware of most of this drama until Bill came over one evening with a 6-pack of beer and a big grin on his face. "You're not gonna believe this," Bill said as he handed Hank a cold one. "Karen got booted from the HOA." Hank nearly spit out his drink laughing. "You're kidding," he said. "Nope," Bill replied. "Turns out she's been scamming everyone for years and trying to use us as pawns in her war against you." Hank shook his head in disbelief. "Well," he said with a smirk, "looks like karma finally caught up with her. But here's where things get really good. Remember all those complaints Karen filed against Hank? Well, once she lost her position in the HOA and people started digging into her shady behavior, those complaints came back to bite her in a big way. Turns out filing false reports with government agencies is not only unethical, it's also illegal. And since Karen had left a paper trail a mile long with all her bogus accusations against Hank, it didn't take long for authorities to start investigating her instead. By the time everything was said and done, Karen ended up facing fines for filing false reports, trespassing charges from her garbage dumping stunt, and an angry mob of former neighbors demanding she pay back every penny she'd misused during her reign as HOA president. As for Hank, well, let's just say he got more than a little satisfaction watching Karen finally get what she deserved, from the comfort of his porch swing with Duke snoozing by his side. If you thought Karen's downfall ended with her being booted from the HOA and slapped with fines, oh no, my friend, you'd be sorely mistaken. Because Karen, in all her infinite wisdom, decided to go out swinging. And by swinging, I mean she tried to sue Hank. That's right, sue Hank. For what, you ask? Well, according to her lawsuit, Hank had caused her emotional distress and irreparable damage to her reputation. When Hank got served the papers, he laughed so hard he nearly fell out of his chair. Emotional distress? He said to Duke, who was sprawled out on the porch like the lazy old hound he was. The only thing distressing about this is how dumb she thinks I am. But Hank wasn't about to let Karen's nonsense ruin his day or his wallet. So he called up his lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Linda who didn't suffer fools lightly. Linda had been handling Hank's legal affairs for years, and she knew exactly how to deal with people like Karen. Let me get this straight, Linda said after reading through the lawsuit. She's suing you for emotional distress because she got caught breaking the law? Pretty much, Hank replied. Linda snorted. This is gonna be fun. And fun it was, at least for Hank and Linda. For Karen, not so much. The first court hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, and Hank showed up in his best pair of jeans and a clean flannel shirt, because while he wasn't about to dress up in a suit, he figured he should at least look respectable. Karen, on the other hand, showed up dressed like she was auditioning for a daytime soap opera. Oversized sunglasses, a dramatic scarf draped over her shoulders, and an expression that screamed victim. The judge, a no-nonsense man with a thick mustache and an even thicker southern drawl, looked over the case file with a raised eyebrow before glancing at Karen. Ms. Peterson, he said slowly, you're claiming that Mr. Lawson caused you emotional distress by what exactly? Karen launched into a long-winded explanation about how Hank had humiliated her by exposing her trespassing and slandered her by telling people about her false complaints. She even threw in some crocodile tears for good measure. The judge listened patiently before turning to Linda. Ms. Carter, he said, addressing Hank's lawyer, do you have anything to add? Linda stood up with a smile that could cut glass. Your Honor, she began. Not only are these claims baseless, but we have evidence that Ms. Peterson has been harassing my client for months. She proceeded to lay out everything. The bogus HOA complaints, the garbage dumping incident, complete with security footage, the falsified property lines, everything. By the time she was done, even the court stenographer looked embarrassed for Karen. But Linda wasn't finished yet. She pulled out a stack of papers and handed them to the judge. These are sworn affidavits from Ms. Peterson's neighbors, she said, detailing years of harassment and misconduct on her part. The judge flipped through the affidavits with a frown before looking back at Karen. Ms. Peterson, he said sternly, it seems to me that you've been causing quite a bit of trouble yourself. Karen stammered something about how she was just trying to protect her community, but the judge wasn't having it. This court is not a platform for personal vendettas, he said firmly. If you have legitimate grievances against Mr. Lawson, you need to provide actual evidence, not baseless accusations. And just like that, Karen's case was dismissed faster than you can say, frivolous lawsuit. But it didn't end there. You see, Linda wasn't just defending Hank. She was countersuing Karen for defamation and harassment. And unlike Karen's lawsuit, this one had teeth. Over the next few weeks, Linda built an airtight case against Karen. She gathered more witness statements from neighbors who were all too happy to share their horror stories about Karen's reign of terror as HOA president. She subpoenaed financial records showing how Karen had misused HOA funds for personal expenses, including that private investigator she'd hired to spy on Hank. And she even dug up old emails where Karen had openly admitted to targeting Hank because she didn't like having a ranch next to her neighborhood. By the time they went back to court for the countersuit hearing, Karen looked like a shadow of her former self. Gone were the oversized sunglasses and dramatic scarves. In their place was a frazzled woman who clearly hadn't slept in days. Hank almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Linda presented their case with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. She laid out every piece of evidence in meticulous detail, painting a clear picture of Karen's pattern of harassment and abuse of power. When it was finally Karen's turn to defend herself, she tried to play the victim card again. But this time it didn't work. "Ms. Peterson," the judge said sternly after listening to her rambling excuses for the umpteenth time, "this court does not tolerate frivolous lawsuits or malicious behavior toward others. Your actions have caused significant harm not only to Mr. Lawson but also to your own community." In the end, the judge ruled in Hank's favor and ordered Karen to pay damages for defamation and harassment. Not just to Hank, but also to several of her former neighbors who had joined the countersuit after hearing about it from Linda. Karen left the courtroom that day looking utterly defeated, and for good reason. Not only had she lost both lawsuits, but she'd also lost whatever shred of credibility she had left in her community. As for Hank, well, let's just say he walked out of that courtroom with a spring in his step and a grin on his face that didn't fade for weeks. Back at the ranch later that evening, Bill stopped by with another six-pack of beer and an ear-to-ear grin. "Looks like you finally got rid of her," Bill said as they clinked bottles. "Yep," Hank replied with a chuckle. "Karma sure does have a funny way of working things out." And as they sat there on the porch watching the sun set over the rolling hills of Montana, Duke snoring softly at their feet, Hank couldn't help but feel grateful for his land, his freedom, and most importantly, for being done with Karen once and for all. Now, you'd think that after losing 2 lawsuits, her position as HOA president, and what little dignity she had left, Karen would have finally learned her lesson. But nope. Karen wasn't just stubborn. She was the kind of stubborn that defied all logic, reason, and basic human decency. And that's how she ended up in court again, this time as the defendant in a full-blown civil trial. You see, Hank wasn't the only one who'd had enough of Karen's antics. After Linda's countersuit exposed all the skeletons in Karen's closet, her former neighbors decided to take matters into their own hands. They banded together and filed a class action lawsuit against her for fraud, mismanagement of HOA funds, and abuse of power. It turns out that Karen's reign of terror had left a long trail of angry homeowners who were more than happy to see her finally get what she deserved. The trial was set for early fall, and by the time it rolled around, word had spread far and wide about the HOA queen gone rogue. Local news stations covered it like it was the OJ trial, complete with dramatic headlines like Karen versus. The neighborhood and HOA drama hits the courtroom. Hank didn't really have a dog in this fight. His battle with Karen was already over, but he couldn't resist showing up to watch the fireworks. So on the first day of the trial, he put on his best flannel shirt, the one without any holes in it, grabbed a thermos of coffee, and headed down to the county courthouse. The courtroom was packed. There were reporters, curious locals, and just about every member of Karen's former HOA sitting in the gallery. Hank spotted Bill near the back and took a seat next to him. "This is gonna be good," Bill whispered with a grin. The trial began with opening statements from both sides. Karen's lawyer, a young guy who looked like he just graduated law school last week, tried his best to paint her as a misunderstood leader who had only ever acted in the best interests of her community. But it was clear he was out of his depth. Meanwhile, the lawyer representing the HOA members, a seasoned litigator named Frank who looked like he could bench press a Buick, wasted no time tearing into Karen's track record. He laid out all the evidence. The forged property lines, the bogus fines, the missing HOA funds that had mysteriously ended up paying for Karen's personal expenses, including a luxury spa weekend and a new set of patio furniture. By the time he finished his opening statement, even Karen's lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Then came the witness testimonies. And oh boy, were they something else. First up was an elderly couple who'd lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years. They told stories about how Karen had fined them for having unauthorized garden gnomes in their front yard and threatened to tow their car because it was too old to meet HOA standards. Next was a single mom who recounted how Karen had tried to evict her from her own home for painting her front door blue instead of beige. She said it clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic, the woman said with a roll of her eyes. But the real showstopper came when Bill took the stand. He brought receipts, literally. He handed over copies of emails where Karen had openly bragged about using HOA funds for personal expenses and schemed about ways to get rid of Hank's ranch once and for all. "I mean, look at this," Bill said as he held up one particularly damning email. She actually wrote, "If we can't fine him into submission, maybe we can make his life so miserable he'll sell." Who does that? Karen sat there stone-faced through most of it. But every now and then she'd mutter something under her breath or glare at whoever was testifying against her. It was clear she still thought she could somehow talk her way out of this mess. But as the evidence piled up, even she had to realize she was fighting a losing battle. By the time closing arguments rolled around, it was obvious which way things were going to go. Frank delivered a blistering final statement that left no doubt about Karen's guilt. "This isn't just about mismanagement or bad leadership," he said. "This is about someone who abused their position of power for personal gain at the expense of an entire community." When it was finally Karen's turn to speak, she tried one last Hail Mary play, blaming everything on everyone else. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said tearfully. "I was just trying to do what I thought was best for our neighborhood. But nobody bought it, not even the judge." After deliberating for less than an hour, a record time for cases like this, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Karen was ordered to pay back every penny she'd embezzled from HOA funds, plus damages for emotional distress caused by her harassment and abuse of power. As she sat there listening to the judge read out her sentence, Hank couldn't help but feel a small pang of pity for her, but only for about half a second. "Looks like justice finally caught up with her," Bill said as they left the courtroom together. "Yep," Hank replied with a grin. And not a moment too soon. Back at his ranch later that evening, Hank sat on his porch with Duke at his feet and watched as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in months, maybe even years, he felt truly at peace. No more surprise inspections, no more bogus complaints, no more drama queen antics from Karen. Life on Lawson Ranch was finally back to normal, or as normal as life could be when you own 200 acres of land and 50 head of cattle. And you know what? That suited Hank just fine. Before she slunk off into obscurity, there was one last chapter to this saga. And let me tell you, it was the cherry on top of this whole ridiculous mess. It started about a month after the trial. Hank was out in his field mending a fence when Bill came jogging over from his side of the property line, waving a piece of paper like it was the winning lottery ticket. "You're not gonna believe this," Bill said, grinning ear to ear. Hank wiped the sweat off his brow and leaned on his hammer. "What now? Karen finally get herself banned from the county?" "Better," Bill said, handing him the paper. "She's selling her house." Hank raised an eyebrow as he scanned the flyer. Sure enough, there it was in black and white. For sale. Beautiful 4-bedroom home in a quiet HOA community. Recently renovated. "Well, I'll be damned," Hank said with a chuckle. "Guess she finally ran out of people to harass." Bill nodded. "Word is she's moving to Florida to live with her sister." Hank smirked. "Florida? She'll fit right in." The news spread fast, and by the end of the week, everyone in the neighborhood knew Karen was leaving. Some folks were relieved, some were downright ecstatic, and a few even threw a little going-away party. Not for Karen, mind you, but to celebrate her departure. Hank didn't bother getting involved in all that. He figured he'd done his part by surviving her nonsense without losing his mind or his ranch. But then something unexpected happened. One morning, Hank was sitting on his porch with Duke when he saw a car pull up to his gate. It wasn't one he recognized. A beat-up old sedan with peeling paint and a bumper sticker that read, "I brake for yard sales." The driver stepped out and started walking up the driveway, holding something in her hand. It was Karen. Hank leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms as she approached. She looked different. Gone were the oversized sunglasses and dramatic scarves. Instead, she wore jeans and a plain sweater, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She almost looked like a normal person, almost. "Morning," Hank said as she reached the porch. Karen hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Morning. There was an awkward silence as she fidgeted with whatever she was holding. It looked like an envelope. "Something I can do for you?" Hank asked finally. Karen cleared her throat and held out the envelope. I wanted to give you this." Hank took it cautiously and opened it up. Inside was a handwritten letter, neatly folded and written in Karen's unmistakable loopy handwriting. "What's this?" he asked. "It's an apology," Karen said quietly. Now that caught Hank off guard. He glanced down at the letter, then back at Karen. "An apology?" She nodded. "For everything, for trespassing on your property, for filing those complaints, for being a terrible neighbor." Hank didn't say anything right away. He just stared at her, trying to figure out if this was some kind of trick or if she'd actually grown a conscience. "I know I can't undo what I did," Karen continued, her voice trembling slightly. "But I've been doing a lot of thinking since everything happened, and I realized I owe you an apology for all of it." Hank studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "Well," he said slowly, "I'll give you credit for coming here and saying it." Karen looked relieved, like she'd been holding her breath this whole time, and managed a small smile. "Thank you," she said softly. They stood there in silence for another moment before Karen turned to leave. "Oh," Hank called after her as she reached her car. "One more thing." She stopped and looked back at him nervously. "Good luck in Florida," he said with a smirk. Karen actually laughed, a real laugh, and nodded before getting into her car and driving away. Now, Hank wasn't one to hold grudges, at least not forever, but he also wasn't about to let Karen off the hook completely. So later that day, he took her apology letter and stuck it under Duke's water bowl as a makeshift coaster. "Looks like we've got ourselves some fancy stationery now," he said with a grin as Duke wagged his tail lazily. In the weeks that followed, life went back to normal, or as normal as life could be on Lawson Ranch. The HOA elected a new president, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Jenkins who couldn't care less about garden gnomes or driveway parking. And peace returned to the neighborhood at last. As for Hank, well, he kept doing what he'd always done. Working hard, taking care of his land, and enjoying every minute of his well-earned freedom. And every now and then, when he sat out on his porch watching the sun set over those rolling Montana hills, he couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. The drama, the lawsuits, the sheer absurdity of it all, and laugh. Because at the end of the day, there's nothing sweeter than knowing you stood your ground against someone like Karen and came out on top. So what do y'all think? Have you ever dealt with someone like Karen? Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. And hey, if you enjoyed this tale of rancher versus HOA chaos, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Thanks for sticking around. And remember, never mess with a rancher who knows how to fight back.